Welcome back to the weekend with Anthony Opperman. That time again to talk a little fishing. And we said last week that things are really starting to heat up, not just with the weather, but also with the fishing. Chris Dunnavant confirmed that for us. And as we kind of get into the summer months when fishing really starts to pick up, also going to see some activity pick up here in the Sports Radio 910 studio. Chris Dunnavant join us and bring along some friends from the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. Chris, I'll let you introduce our guest for this week's segment.
Yeah, really, thank you, Anthony. Glad to be here and happy to welcome Alan Weaver into the studio. Alan's our fish passage coordinator for the department and oversees all the shad fishing and the shad studies and the passageway in the rivers, the James River especially. And so welcome, Alan. Good to have you.
Thanks. Glad to be here and looking forward to talking about shad and the upcoming spring and all the activity we'll see on the river soon.
Alan, I guess first and foremost, just give us a little bit of your background and how you got to your current position with the DGIF.
Okay, I started off at VCU, so I'm a Ram, go Rams, maybe next year. But went there for graduate school, so that brought me to Richmond originally. Spent a few years in Florida working on the urban fishing project down there, and came back to Virginia several years ago to start working on fish passage restoration and shad restoration, trying to restore these highly important ecological fish, and they're also used to be very important commercially. Unfortunately, we've had a moratorium on shad for several years now, and trying to get these fish back so that people can enjoy them. They're fun to catch. Of course, American shad have to be released. They are under a moratorium, and working on restoring habitat by removing dams, getting fish access back to their historical spawning grounds. The American shad, after all, is the founding fish, so it's a very important. Some might argue it's the sturgeon. They're both very important, obviously, but American shad is one of our primary targets.
Alan Weaver and Chris Dunnavant for the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. And Alan, just talk about the reason for that moratorium on American shad.
Yes, back in the early days of commercial harvest, what happened is that they got better and better at being able to catch fish, setting large nets, gill nets, pound nets, staked gill nets, and without probably realizing it, they were really depleting this group of species of fish. And it was to meet a need. Historically, the American shad harvest in Virginia was worth equal to the importance of half a hog crop. So that gives you an idea of how important it was to feed the colonists and, of course, the early Native Americans. So, at some point the harvest got out of control, and during the 50s and 60s, the 1950s and 60s, there was somewhat of sustainable harvest. But then by the late 80s, the population really crashed, and the commercial harvest fell way off because the shad were gone. So by 1994, in Virginia, sort of falling in line with some of the other Bay states, we initiated a harvest moratorium, and that was to protect the American shad, to give them a chance to come back. And so it took a long time to sort of bring the population down, and it's sort of a long, patient process trying to bring them back to healthier numbers. And that's the process we're in now.
Alan Weaver with Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, joining Chris Dunnavant and myself here on the weekend with Anthony Opperman. And Chris, we talk about it all the time, just the importance of knowing the different rules and the different regulations. And this is also very applicable to shad because you've got the American shad, which you have the moratorium on, but the hickory shad, not necessarily the case depending on where you're at on the river. So definitely being informed is important in this thing.
You're right. And in a lot of my workshops, I emphasize how important it is to be up to date on our regulations. And the shad are just a perfect example because, as we've said, the American shad, there's a moratorium, but hickory shad, below the fall line in Richmond, you can keep hickory shad. But if you're fishing above the fall line in Richmond, you cannot keep hickory shad. So it's just not, a blanket statement. You need to know the regulations for a particular species, but also the area, the place you're fishing. It might be different on different sections of the river. So studying those regulations, visiting our website, going to the VMRC website for shad and such. Also, the regulations are posted there. So make sure before you go you know what you're after, how to identify them, what the regulations are, and also based on location.
And if you're confused about maybe even what type of a shad that you have, well, I guess first and foremost, talk about the difference between a hickory shad and an American shad, and maybe, Alan, you can chime in on this as well since you're the expert biologist in the room. But then also, if you are confused, a simple rule that maybe you can use to make sure you don't get in any trouble with this.
Right. Definitely, if you're not sure, throw it back. It's better, than to throw it back and make sure you're right than to face a citation. But, from my experience, I know the difference between a hickory and American, and you can actually, when you hook one, you can almost identify it right then.
If you close the fish's mouth and it has that protruding lower jaw, it's a hickory. And again, depending on where you're at, if you're downstream of the fall line in the Chesapeake Bay drainage, you can actually still keep those. If you're upstream of the fall line, you can't. They fall in with all the rest of them, and it's a zero possession. So the American shad have a mouth that when you close it, it's even. The top and bottom jaw is even. And with the hickory shad, it's got that protruding jaw that juts out. And once you see a few of them and get used to that, and that's really the best way to tell them apart.
Weekly wildlife segment here on The Weekend with Anthony Opperman. Got our friends from the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries join us in studio. And Alan, you bring up herring, and that's another new regulation that people are going to need to be aware of for this year, right?
Yes. The herring moratorium went into effect as of January 1st, 2012, and that was set by the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, VMRC. And the reason for that moratorium is because the herring stocks are also in a depleted state, and the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission has essentially mandated that each Atlantic coast state do something about the river herring populations. And so without the information that's necessary to show that we don't need to do anything to protect herring, we don't have enough of the population data, the moratorium has been issued. And that means that any blueback herring or alewife that you catch incidentally needs to be thrown back. So this is going to affect people that dip net for a river herring, that might jig for them. And this is the Chesapeake Bay drainage that's been added. The North Carolina drainage, the Albemarle Sound drainage, there has already been a moratorium on river herring harvest for the last couple years. So now, all these herring that people might, throw a cast net for, or dip net, or jig for to use as bait, it's a zero possession limit in the state of Virginia.
And Chris, I know that there may be some anglers that get frustrated by these rules and regulations, but again, I think it's important to stress that this is to not only protect what people love to do, maybe as a recreational sport, maybe as somewhat of an industry, but it's there to protect the environment and some species and populations that have existed here well before any of us.
That's correct. And, that's one of the really benefits of when you purchase your fishing license, that money comes right back to our department. And that's the kind of research that we're doing to make sure we're monitoring these populations. That's what Alan does. And it's really to protect these populations. And like you said, it's for a whole purpose of the environment, the ecosystem, the balance of that. But it's also, too, for the anglers, because we want to preserve these populations to enjoy them for catch, for sport, but also for food. And but also the whole ecosystem depends on these bait fish sources for food too. They support the bottom of the pyramid. So these populations are very important. And yes, people can get frustrated, but there is a bigger purpose in making these regulations.
Chris Dunnavant and Alan Weaver from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries join us here on The Weekend with Anthony Opperman. And guys, Chris knows this really well, Alan, but it doesn't take long to fill up roughly 15 minutes on this segment. It's really easy to get there when we get into talking in depth about fishing. But how are those American shad coming back? Some of the data that you guys have been doing recently, what's that showing right now?
Well, fortunately, last year in 2011, we saw a pretty good increase in the number of American shad going through the last dam in the series of dams on the James River, and that's Bocher's Dam. We have a fishway there. That dam could not be breached or removed or notched, so we built a technical fishway that allows the fish to swim through the dam, and we have a counting window where we can enumerate the fish, any of the fish. Some years we do all the species. Mostly we do the American shad. And last year we saw a very good increase, more like we saw in 2002, with nearly 1,000 American shad making it through the fall line and through the fishway. The past several years has been kind of lean, and we haven't seen a lot of American shad in the river, or at least making it up the fall line. And we've kind of seen the same thing up and down the East Coast. We study what the other fishways are counting up and down the East Coast, so to see where we fall into, in comparison. And it's been pretty similar. And several different data sources, gill net catches, electrofishing results, creel surveys. It kind of all shows kind of a similar pattern that about roughly 10 years ago, we were seeing pretty good numbers of fish, American shad migrating up the river, getting through fishways, and then it kind of really tailed off. And like I said, fortunately last year we saw a pretty good increase. So we're hoping that this year and the next several years we'll continue to see that build. So we're not there yet. We do not have what we would consider a restored American shad population yet. But what we have seen is, anglers are having a lot of fun with them. Being able to target American shad every once in a while and have that fun of catching a pretty good fighting fish. Of course, they have to get thrown back. We've kind of talked about that a little bit. But there's signs of hope for these species of fish, and we hope to continue to see positive increase in their numbers. And we also have a stocking program. We've stocked, I believe, close to 114 million American shad fry into the James since 1994. And that's an ongoing process, trying to help reseed the river. These fish come back to the river that they're spawned in or stocked into. They spend about average of 5 years at sea in the Atlantic coast migration, and then they come into their natal river, which simply means they come back to the river that they're from. They go home to spawn and help perpetuate the species. And fortunately, this type of fish is a very prolific spawner. They lay lots of eggs, and the whole idea is that they just flood the environment with their offspring because they are at the bottom of that food chain, and they need to have lots of offspring to be able to perpetuate their species.
Alan, great stuff this morning. Really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation and share some of your knowledge with us, and looking forward to having you back on in future segments talking about other segments of the fish population, and then also continuing to follow what's going on with the American shad. Really appreciate you taking the time. Chris, thank you so much for bringing in your friends as always. Appreciate it. And like I said, it's going to be busy in this studio bringing in people to talk about some fishing because we're really starting to heat up.
It is. It's definitely heating up. The fishing's getting better, and so we'll just have lots of good things to talk about to come.
And Chris Dunnavant, Alan Weaver from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. When we come back here on the weekend with Anthony Opperman, we got my game plan for the weekend. Stay tuned.
The show is almost over, but the weekend is just getting started. More of The Weekend with Anthony Opperman is next on Sports Radio 910.